That's what he's doing. In other words, what Paul is doing in 12 and 13 is he's creating for us an awareness of what the renewed mind looks like when we're talking about these cultural questions. And so let's jump right on into it. In verse 3, he begins talking about our identity. And let me just invite you to think about what the world has to say about your identity. If you're paying attention to the vast majority of the statements in our world, whether verbal or visual or whatever, the world would say when it comes to your identity, you are what you feel like. You are what you feel like. For example, someone is in high school and he's feeling a bit depressed. Well, there's a whole bunch of other people around that high school who also feel depressed. And they're listening to the depressed music and reading the depressive books and writing depressive poetry. And it feels good to them to be in that communication with each other about being that kind of depressed society. And so now they meet together and they wear the same things and they have an authority. The depressed public persona out there who's singing depressive music now is their authority on how to be depressed better. And so now they're in this cultural group and they identify themselves with a name. They're not using the word depressed. They're using the name like emo. They're just emotional people or something like that. Now I'm stereotyping. If you classify yourself as emo, I love you. And I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just trying to be hypothetical here about how our identity in this world around us is wrapped up into how I feel. Okay? If I respond emotionally to a certain category of society, I identify myself with that. If I have emotional desires for one particular category of person, I have a label I can put on myself for that desire. And now I am that person. And how I feel determines who I am. That's the pattern of the world, but that's not God's pattern. See what Paul has to say. Verse 3, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. That's the other thing. The world would tell us, think of yourself as high as you possibly can. Self-esteem is great. Imagine yourself as great as you possibly can be, and then don't give up until the people around you agree with it. And if they don't, find new friends. Keep searching until you find someone who agrees with how good you think you are. But Paul says, no, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. This is fascinating. He doesn't say with humility. He doesn't say think of yourself with humility. He says think of yourself with sober judgment. Sober means you're not inebriated. You're not drunk. You're thinking clearly. It means you're rational. You've got it all. You've got the objective facts. Think of yourself the way you really are. Think of yourself with sober judgment. It is not arrogant for you and me to know who we are and to be confident in that. It's not arrogant for you to know your gifts, your skills, your abilities, who God made you to be, and to walk in that. It is arrogant for you to assume that those gifts, abilities, and whatever else may be there belong to you and are for your benefit. Because as we're going to see just in a moment, arrogance doesn't come with when I know who I am. Arrogance comes with when I'm using it for me. My identity is not about just me alone. Look what Paul has to say. He says, think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. It's not about you, it's about God. He gave you something. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. You know what Paul says about our identity? It's not about what you feel like. It's about what contribution you make. Your identity, check this out. Your identity, Paul says, is like a member of a body. And what happens if you take the eye out of a body and leave it on the sidewalk and say, do your eye thing really well? Squish just like grape. plan. But if you take an arm away from the body, is it even an arm? It can't do the work of the arm if it's not with the body. A hand can't do the work of the hand if it's not with the body. An eye can't do the work of an eye if it's not with the body. No, check it, no individual member even has an identity unless it's with the community. You are not you unless you are with us. Paul says your identity doesn't even exist apart from the body, because a hand is just a lump of flesh. An eye is just a lump of flesh. They can't even be what they're supposed to be. I meet Christians all the time, and I'll talk to them. They'll say, yeah, God is number one in my life, and I love God, and I'm committed to Him, but I'm just sick of the church, and I don't want to have anything to do with the church. And they come up with all kinds of excuses, politics, or I couldn't find a minister who spoke the way I wanted to hear it, or music that I liked, or whatever. There are all kinds of reasons for why someone doesn't want to be part. But you know what the bottom line is? They're listening to what the world says about them and not what God says about them. Because what the world says is how you feel is who you are. And if you feel like you're a Christian outside the walls of the church, go on, feel that way. Go on, be that way. But what God says is, no, it's not how you feel that determines who you are. It's what contribution you're making in the context of the whole thing that determines who you are. Your identity is in the community. Let's move on. The second question we ask is not identity. The second question is relationships. Who do I hang with? And look what Paul says in verse 9. He says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. You know what our world says about who you should hang with? The world would say, be with the people who lift you up. There's a person in your life and they're not very encouraging to you, don't spend time with them. Be with the encouraging people. Be with the positive people. Be with the people who lift you up. And though that's good emotional advice, it's different from what Paul is saying here. Because Paul doesn't say, hang out with the people who love you. He says, love them. Honor one another above yourselves. See, this is the renewed mind. It's not, I get with those who lift me up. I lift up those who I'm with. The world says, hang out with those who lift you up, and the renewed mind says, no, I lift up everyone around me. That's why it even says this interesting phrase, never be lacking in zeal. Always be enthusiastic about your service to God. Keep your spiritual fervor. Do you realize how exciting it is for someone around you when you're enthusiastic about what God is doing in your life? Your enthusiasm lifts them up. And it's not just the people that you like or the people who are somewhat like you. It's even your enemies. See the next thing Paul says. He says, bless those who persecute you. They're not lifting me up, but I'm still going to lift them up. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. The world says, base your relationships on who lifts you up. The renewed mind says, everyone's in relationship with you, lift them up. Lift them up. Okay, but the next question is, who's my authority? Paul goes to that. Chapter 13, he says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. Oh, great, Paul's bringing government into this. The governing authorities. Check out what he says, though. He says, "For there's no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. We live in America. We voted for President Barack Obama. No, God put him there. Wait a minute. Yeah, I don't know how it works. I don't know the mechanics of it. But after all of our votes get counted, God's choice gets into the right place. Does that mean that President Obama is the best president ever? I'm not saying anything about that. What I'm saying is he's there because God put him there, and we need to respect that. And if the president changes this next year, or if the president stays the same, it doesn't matter because God has a reason for that person to be there. And so the world would say, I respect those that I like. God would say, no, you give respect to those I've put in authority. Let's read the rest of it. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it's necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience, because God put them in their place. God put them in that authority. And this, verse 6, is also why you pay taxes. Ouch. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. God says, I put them in their place, and if they have a salary, so what? Pay it. If it costs you more in taxes, so what? Pay it. I put them there, and we happen to be in this weird privileged position where we can contribute to the changes in our society, and God isn't saying don't contribute. He's just saying don't fight, don't war, don't oppose, and especially offer respect and honor. The world says, I respect those I respect. Paul says, God says, the renewed mind says, respect those God put in authority over you. One last question. What's my responsibility? And here it is. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to